Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our education book talk today with Ilana Redstone. I'm Jenna Robinson, president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is a nonprofit organization dedicated to excellence and accountability in higher education. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-based reform. You can find out more at jamesgmartin.center. Thank you to all of you viewers and donors for making events like this possible. Although this event is free, we appreciate those of you who made voluntary contributions. Your support fuels everything we do. The Martin Center's education book discussions are quarterly online events with authors of recent or sort of recent books about higher education or related topics. However, I want to tell you about our next book talk, which will be something a little bit different. Our next book talk, our next guest will be Professor Don Taylor of Duke University. Professor Taylor will discuss his forthcoming book, Renewing the Marketplace of Ideas on Elite University Campuses, and webinar attendees to that talk, which will be in April, will have a chance to be part of the writing process by giving Professor Taylor feedback and asking questions to help him hone his ideas before the book is fully written. So watch your inbox for more information about this unique opportunity to help guide the direction of a new book about higher education. I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Redstone shortly, but I want to take 1 minute to tell you about how this event will run. First, Professor Redstone will talk for about 20 minutes about her book. Then she and my colleague, George Leaf, will have a short discussion. And at around 3:15, George will start posing questions from the audience. Viewers on Zoom, you can post a question by using the Q&A icon at any time. And viewers on Facebook, simply post your questions in the comments section, and we'll be sure to monitor those as well. Also, I just wanted to let you know that we are recording this event so you can watch it later or share it online. We'll be sure to send you the link as soon as the video is posted. Again, thank you for being here and for supporting our work. We hope to see many of you at the next webinar in April. So the book we're talking about today is The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less, which was published in September 2024. The book defines what a certainty trap is and what happens when people across the political divide fall into one. The author is Ilana Redstone, a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and she also co-directs the Mill Institute at the University of Austin. Professor Redstone, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Just as a point of correction, so there's no confusion, I am a co-founder of the Mill Institute. I don't actually co-direct it anymore. So I can refer people to who is in charge of that now, but it's no longer me. I've turned my focus elsewhere. So I want to start by, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for being here and just even showing interest in this work. I appreciate it. And I want to start by telling you a short story. And it's not a story that I can take credit for, but it's a story that was told 20 years ago. And some of you may have heard it. Some of you may be familiar with it already. It's from David Foster Wallace's graduation speech that he gave at Kenyon College in 2005. And in that speech, he tells a couple of parables. And I'm gonna retell one of them here. And overall, the speech is, he talks about he's fundamentally talking about certainty, although he doesn't tie it to particularly to political topics, which is what we'll do here. But let me tell you one of the parables that he gave in that graduation speech. He said there are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other is an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, "Look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from the camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost and couldn't see a thing. And it was 50 below, and so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, 'Oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard, and I'm going to die if you don't help me.' And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. And he says, 'Well, then you must believe now. After all, here you are alive.' The atheist just rolls his eyes. 'No, man, all that was a couple Eskimos happened to come wandering by and showed me the way back to camp.'" So Wallace has lots to say on this in his speech, but part of his comments include a version of the following. And now I'm shifting to my words rather than his. So it's easy in some ways to hear this story as a reminder or a warning to not be quick to call one man right and the other one wrong. But to focus on this and this alone risks missing a broader point about their mutual dismissal of one another's ideas. The non-religious guy is certain in his is certain in his dismissal of the possibility that the passing Eskimos had anything to do with his prayer for help. And to be sure, while we may not see it in this particular story, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogant and certain of their own interpretations too. In other words, the religious dogmatist problem is the same as that of the story's unbeliever. Blind certainty that amounts to a closed-mindedness and an imprisonment so total that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. So before we dive into this talk, I want to be clear about what I mean by when I talk about certainty. I mean, a person can be certain about something or not. So in the way that I'm using this term, it wouldn't make sense to say that someone is a little bit certain or a lot certain. That's what I call, and we'll see this in one of the slides, that's something that I call confidence. So certainty has this specific meaning. Okay, so it turns out that certainty does all kinds of things to our thinking. And I'm going to talk about three of them in particular. Some of those are obvious. So here I'm just showing you, you should see a slide of Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. He did this by asking a question. And so one of the things certainty does is it keeps us from asking questions. Salk asked, if benign viruses are injected into a healthy person's bloodstream, would the person's immune system create antibodies that would prove resistant to future exposure? A version of this had been tried previously in the 1930s, but Salk pushed forward anyway, and he succeeded. But the point here is that he started with a question, and that if he had been certain, if he had treated this issue as settled, he wouldn't have asked. So that tends to be one of the more self-evident consequences of certainty. Here's another one. Certainty also makes us forget that we might be wrong. So this is really what people think of when we think of intellectual humility. It turns out that a lack of intellectual humility tends to be pretty easy to see in other people. It's a lot harder to see in ourselves. So on the slide, I just took a still image from the movie Men in Black. And so this is the point in the movie, if people remember it, where Will Smith's sort of toward the beginning of the movie, Will Smith's character is the one that's obviously in clear, and then Tommy Lee Jones is the blurry face in the foreground. And so it's just when Will Smith's character has found out in the movie that that there are aliens walking among them. And so Tommy Lee Jones' character says, 1,000 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, they knew the Earth was flat. 15 minutes ago, you knew we humans were alone on it. Imagine what you'll know tomorrow. So that's the second of our consequences. And here's the third. Certainty keeps us from being clear about our assumptions and values. So here, the picture is I just found it online, of a person stealing a car. So I want you to sort of run the following thought experiment. Imagine that we're looking out a window and that we see someone stealing a car. And let's assume that we have every reason to believe it is not their car, they don't have permission to use it, etc. So if I turn to you and we're looking out the window and I turn to you and I say, wow, can you believe that guy? I have a particular expectation about your response. My expectation is that you say something like, oh my God, that's nuts, or that's crazy. I can't believe he's doing that. Right. And there's an assumption in there that I'm not saying out loud. That is that you share my value that stealing is wrong. And in many cases, as in this case, it's probably not about assumption. In fact, it allows us it allows our social interactions to be more efficient, right? So that I don't therefore have to stop and say to you, first, hey, do you think stealing is wrong before I then make the comment that I made? It turns out that this lack of clarity is not such a great assumption when it comes to controversial topics, and we'll see how that works. So these second and third consequences in particular are the things that lead us to conclude that anyone who disagrees must be either hateful or stupid. And here's an example in other words, it leads to judgment. And I want to show you in the next couple of slides some examples of what I mean. The first examples I'm going to show you are not particularly, they may be contentious, but they're not politically contentious. And then we'll get right to those. So here's a couple of examples, and these are the not contentious, not politically contentious ones. And what I want you to do with the next 3 slides, this one and then the 2 that follow, is I just want you to look at the first column and treat it as given. Try to avoid the headspace of, well, this is or isn't true, or I believe this or I don't believe it, and all the reasons why. Just run the thought experiment. Give yourself the space to run the thought experiment and say, what would happen if I just treat the thing in the column on the left, if I just treat it as given? And see the judgment that comes out the side. And so part of what I'm trying to do here is make clear this link between certainty and judgment. So the first one is a healthy relationship means never going to bed angry. Judgment, couples who don't resolve conflicts immediately must not really care about each other. Certainty, successful people wake up early and follow a strict morning routine. Anyone who sleeps past 7 a.m. lacks the discipline needed for real success. Certainty, good parents always put their children first, no matter what. Parents who prioritize their own needs sometimes are being selfish. So again, I'm just asking you to treat the first column as given, assume it's definitive and final, and see what comes out the other side. So here's some more, I'm going to give you 2 more contentious examples. The first one is gender is a social construct. Judgment might be anyone who believes in innate gender differences must be perpetuating patriarchal oppression. The other, biology and gender are unrelated. Anyone who questions whether children should be given puberty blockers is transphobic. So again, treat the first column as given and see what comes out the other side. The next example that I'm going to give you is also politically contentious, and I'm going to give it to you from 2 different political angles. And then we're going to go from there into talking about confidence. So here's another politically contentious topic. The 2020 election was completely secure. Treat that as given. Anyone questioning election procedures must be promoting dangerous conspiracy theories. The 2020 presidential election was a sham. Anyone who accepts the election results must be brainwashed by mainstream media. So I want to introduce this as we transition into where we talk about confidence. And part of what I want to do is start with a particular claim, and that is that nothing is certain. Now, one of the things that there's a couple of concerns that often come up with this work. One, and I'll do my best to address both of them. One is that means that any explanation is as good as any other, and that suddenly everything we know is a coin flip. That's one concern, and I'll address that here. The other concern is that leaving certainty behind, avoiding the certainty trap, means that we can no longer say this is good, this is bad, etc. And that is also not the case, and I'll explain why. But let's start with the first one. So if I say nothing is certain, let's take a few statements and see what that means. And I'm going to give you some examples and understand that the numbers that I'm attaching to these are numbers that I literally made up. There's nothing scientific behind them. So I'm going to start with this one. The Earth is flat. To that, I gave a 0.01. And with all of these, I only go out 2 decimal places just in the interest of space. There's nothing, this is where I assigned it. But here's another one. Coffee is good for your health. I gave that 0.3. So I'm going to just give you a bunch of examples here. And my screen is a little bit laggy, but hopefully it'll cooperate. Here is the next one. There is intelligent life somewhere in the universe. I really don't know. Some days I have different ideas on this, but right now I'm going to give it a 0.5. Some days I probably would put it higher. Exercise makes people healthier. I think that's pretty likely to be true. I think there's lots of evidence that suggests that that is the case. I'm going to give it a 0.7. Maybe I should have put it higher, but for now, that's where it is. The sun will rise tomorrow. Certainly all of my past experience tells me that that is in fact what will happen. I'm going to give it a 0.95. Maybe I could imagine an argument that would say to move that further to the right. And then there's all of these statements. There's a whole, and I'm only going to give a small sampling of them, that would exist essentially right at the number 1. And we treat them as though they're certain. And it doesn't matter. The certainty trap, the problem I'm trying to solve in this book is the problem of contempt for disagreement. And the way certainty makes it impossible to have good faith disagreement. Um, so it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be questioning everything all of the time, because not all certainty is a trap. The trap is in the contempt piece, because of what that means for social trust and for trust in institutions, and frankly for democracy itself. So at this 0.99, I'm just going to throw out a bunch of things. If I drop a ball on Earth, it will fall forward. Breathing air helps keep humans alive. There's stuff all around us. This is a chair. So these are all things that we essentially treat as certain, and I'm not saying we should do anything different than that. There's nothing about leaving the certainty trap that suggests that we should no longer treat them as given, even though there is this infinitesimally small space between them and the number one, these claims and the number one. Okay, so then I'm going to give you, the next I'm going to give you are two claims that are often presented with certainty, particularly in higher education, that are very contentious. And the fact that we don't ever get to have a conversation about where they belong on this spectrum is because that conversation acknowledges the uncertainty in the first place, requires acknowledging the uncertainty in the first place. So the first one I gave you before, gender is a social construct. In order to have a conversation about where this falls, that's supposed to move smoothly, not block jumping like that, but where this falls on this spectrum, we would first have to recognize that it's not definitive. And therein lies much of the problem that we face. Here's another one. Disparities are evidence of racism. Again, in order to have a conversation about where this would go on this spectrum, we would have to, that would require first recognizing the fundamental uncertainty in the claim. And again, when it comes to higher education, and it's not the only institution, but that's the one we're talking about today, this is not something that we've done. I imagine this audience knows this well. This is not something we've done particularly well. So one of the concerns, I told you the other concern that comes up a lot with this work. One was that any explanation is as good as any other, but because of the way this spectrum works, that is not the case. The other is that we can no longer say this is good and this is bad. And the worry is that avoiding the certainty trap means that this idea, so I'm using the example of being nice to people, is important, that where we stick this on this spectrum doesn't matter. Any place is as good as any other. And why would any place, by what logic would, further to the right be better than further to the left? That is not actually a function of certainty. What certainty does is it keeps us from making where this belongs on this spectrum depends on what our goal is. And certainty keeps us from making that goal clear. And I'll give you two examples. Here's one. Let's say our goal is to develop and mentor junior employees in a workplace. I can imagine an argument that being nice to people would be fairly important when doing that. You could make broader goals, like living in a society living in a politically pluralistic society, right? That's not the one that I listed here, but I could imagine that as well. By contrast, imagine a goal where your goal is to lead an emergency response during a crisis. Being nice to people strikes me as probably less important in that case. So the certainty part, it's not that any position is as good as any other. It's that the certainty keeps us from making the goals clear. And I want to give you a politically contentious example just to show you how this works there as well. This is relating to immigration. We should welcome as many people as possible who are fleeing worse situations in other countries. Where does this go? Depends on the goal. So if I have a goal that says immigration should provide sanctuary to as many people as possible, then it makes sense to move this to the right. Whereas if my goal is that immigration should benefit the economy for people already in the host country, that has a different set of implications. Okay, so I'm trying to be mindful of the time here, and I want to make sure we have lots of times for questions. So I want to make two claims. One is that, so in terms of this question of, well, why should we care about this? Avoiding the certainty trap matters for political pluralism. Because certainty leads to judgment, judgment leads to contempt, contempt to resentment, and resentment erodes trust. It also matters, and this goes back to the Jonas Salk answer or example that I gave earlier. It also matters just when it comes to understanding the world around us. So this simple graph that I drew is really on the y-axis is just what we don't know. So higher up on that axis means there's more stuff we don't know. Lower means there's less we don't know. And on the x-axis is time, earlier and later. The idea here is simply to understand what this says, that this curve never crosses the x-axis, that our knowledge increases, but there's always some chance that we learn something tomorrow that upends everything we know today. So for when it comes to just understanding the world, there are these implications for political pluralism, and there are also implications for just understanding the world around us. Okay, so what do you do? You can remember that first of all, you don't this is not necessarily about interacting with other people, although it has implications for how we interact with people who disagree. This is about how we think on our own, even in a room by ourselves, about contentious topics. Controversial topics are morally and ethically complicated. Frankly, when they stop being morally and ethically complicated, they stop being controversial. Anything can be questioned. Any claim, value, belief, principle can be questioned, although we do have to name it first. Questioning something requires naming it. Questioning something doesn't mean disagreeing with it necessarily. So if I say, this is about just giving people the space to sort of think through things. So if I say to students and I say, why is slavery bad? That is not, by definition, a claim that slavery or an argument that slavery isn't bad. Right? I'm saying there's value in making our thinking on these topics explicit and clear. And finally, trying on an idea doesn't always mean agreeing with it. So if I say, I wonder what the benefits are of living in a dictatorship, it doesn't necessarily mean that I want to move to North Korea. Okay, so it's something you can practice very much on your own. You can pick an issue you feel strongly about, so strongly that you don't see how anyone could disagree. Challenge yourself to think how a person with good intentions and the same information that you have might see things differently. And I'm going to stop here because again, I'm mindful of the time and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to stop there. If you find this work interesting or raises questions for you, the best thing that you can do is talk about it with people. Talk about this work. Okay, I'm going to stop and turn it over to George.
Well, very good. Enjoyed your discussion, Elena. And I have come up with a number of questions I'd like to pose to you. Let's
Yeah.
start with this one. You say that our divisions have become so severe that we seem to be heading for a national political divorce. Is it your sense that certainty traps are making our politics more severe and intractable?
Yeah, so I guess the way I would think about that is it's almost like we're heading, I mean, there's lots of, this is Phil Gottman's research on contempt and merit, the end of marriages and the end of relationships, and that contempt predicts the end of relationships. It's the single strongest predictor. And so to the extent that what we're seeing is contempt for disagreement, we would be heading for a national divorce. I'm less sure that that's an option. I think I'm saying that we are up to the brim with contempt, and that has all of these other effects that we're seeing unfold in terms of kind of what I said during the talk, both in terms of social trust and in terms of trust or how we trust institutions. And so I can absolutely see how certainty has, and the certainty trap in particular, how it has and is making our politics more severe and intractable. I think it's worth pointing out that there is an asymmetry here that is, and I'll get to this actually more when I write in the next book, but there's an asymmetry to how certainty and the effects of certainty have played out across political parties, in the sense that certainty, like we saw with the first examples that I gave, certainty and judgment, that relationship is quite consistent. On the political right, among conservatives, when you see the effects of certainty and the certainty trap, a lot of times that certainty is coming from sort of an external source. And by that, I mean it's often coming from religious beliefs or faith commitments. And the effect is still the same, but it's coming from an external source. On the left, what has happened, and this again, I'll have more time to go into this in the next book, is that certainty and therefore the condemnation of disagreement is built into the moral and political framework itself.
Well, I think I'd have to say you're right on that point. Let's go on to my second question. You teach at the University of Illinois, and I'm sure your sociology classes get into some rather heated issues. So, how do you try to prepare your students to handle the heated issues? Do you try to get them to understand their certainty traps? And do you get any opposition from students who have such an emotional attachment to their existing beliefs that they tune you out on that point?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, when it comes to students, I talk about sort of the most controversial issues all the time. I will say that, so I feel like I should just preface what I'm saying by acknowledging that. So, for example, right now I'm teaching the Beyond the Bigots and Snowflakes class for the sixth time at the University of Illinois. And that class is an elective. And so the students who, there's self-selection in terms of who finds their way into my classroom in the first place. So I just want to sort of acknowledge that. Having said that, what I've found is that students are quite open to thinking things through. And part of that, I think, is I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to tell them that they need to change their minds or that they need to have a particular view of abortion, gun control, Black Lives Matter, DEI, whatever. In fact, just yesterday, I had a whole class, the Bigots and Snowflakes class, we talked about why what's reasonable concerns about DEI might look like, and what are some of the objections, and how that's not, how the sloppy thinking that goes into just dismissing those concerns as being born of racism. And so I found that like when I sort of lay this out for them and just say, okay, this is about how we think, and sort of being clear and questioning our own thinking, I find that they've been very open to it. Like I think, and I also try and I do my best to model it. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Let's take a question from one of our audience members. How successful have you been in persuading others, especially students, of this? Do you have any suggestions or advice in doing that?
You know, I mean, how successful? I think that this work tends to resonate very quickly with there are some people in my experience with students, like a lot of them, they sort of get it. And what I end up hearing is, and this can happen rather quickly, is what they'll bump up against is that what they're hearing in my class actually sort of is crashing up against what they're hearing in other classes. And I've had students, in fact, last week I had a student say that in class, that one of his other sociology classes, that it was sort of running right up against this, and he was just aware of it. And I said, well, I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I was like, I'm not surprised. And so in general, I do have, there are always some students that they hear this and they are like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. And I have a small little group of students that I work with to try and dig into, students who are just really interested in this work. But in general, like I've found that I've found a pretty receptive audience, again, with the self-selection in mind.
Let me ask you about that self-selection.
Yeah.
What would you say is the breakdown in that self-selected group? Or do you find it's that you don't get many of the really zealot type students, and they're the ones who probably need it the most?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly possible. That is entirely possible. And if I were pulling all the puppet strings, I would probably weave this into like an orientation or make it, have it meet some sort of gen ed requirement. Um, I I don't. I mean, I am in a sociology department, so I mean, and again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. To the extent higher education leans left, sociology within higher education leans. I mean, if you go any further left, you're going to fall off of something. So it is the case that I don't know if I see the students as being zealots. I don't, that's not how I see it. Most of them are on the left. Um, and part of what I'm telling them is, look, here are the constraints of the thinking, right? Of like sort of dismissing this as racist and that as transphobic and whatever. Like if you want to do that and you want to say your intent, your reasoning, a person's intent, a person's reasoning doesn't matter, then that's fine, but understand the consequences of that. And it doesn't make sense to then say that the thing that you're concerned about is political polarization, social trust, trust in institutions, all of these other things, because it just becomes incoherent. And that is, they generally are very open to that in my experience.
All right, let me pose this question, Elena. There are quite a few professors who teach from the standpoint of certainty.
Yeah.
They treat contentious issues as though they are matters of black and white, obvious right answers versus obvious wrong answers. Do you think academic leaders should call them out and perhaps make promotion contingent on not teaching that way?
So interesting. So to the first part, like, are there a lot of faculty? I mean, obviously, yes. Yes, 100%. It's pervasive in, this is pervasive in higher education. That is certainly the case. As to whether promotion should be tied, I don't know. I guess personally, I'm not a big fan of sort of legislating how people think. I would rather be in a world where there's sort of an understanding like, okay, this is actually what that means. And this is what it means for our political conversations. This is what it means for democracy and people kind of getting there on their own. The reality is, and maybe that sounds insanely naive, I just think that with legislated solutions, I think you end up, I think there's a real risk that you end up creating more problems than you solve. And so about tying promotion, I don't know. I mean, let me give you an example, like so I was on the courses and curriculum committee last year. This is not, it's sort of back ending into your question. I was on the courses and curriculum committee at the university for the College of Arts and Sciences last year. And we would just review course proposals for, new courses that were being suggested by faculty and instructors and whatever. And they came to this committee after they'd gone through the departments. And the last course that we reviewed at the end of the academic year last year, so last spring, was a course called Racism in the United States. And it was put forward by the psychology department. And it was a course about, so part of what faculty submit is they submit like a syllabus and a description and et cetera, and what are the requirements of the course. And what was in the course was a lot of what's fairly standard fare, sort of in terms of talking about systemic racism and systemic discrimination, unconscious bias, et cetera. And I said to the committee, which was like I don't know, 8 or 9 faculty members who sit on this committee, and I said, it's great. Seems like a reasonable course. I said, I don't think it should be called Racism in the United States. I said, well, what this course is, I said, it's a progressive view of racism in the United States. I said, that's what it is. And so it either needs to bring the content in line with the title or bring the title in line with the content. Like, but calling it, this is the problem of certainty. And no one in the committee, no one really disagreed with what I was saying, but no one wanted to implement this change. So the course, it went forward, and I never heard another thing about it. That's not like your question was about individual promotion and sort of, I think there have to be ways into solving this problem that aren't necessarily punitive, but that create a different set of incentives that increase sort of just a general understanding of what's going on. I don't know. Again, maybe that's hopelessly naive, but we haven't tried it, so I don't know.
Well, or perhaps the way to approach it would be selecting faculty members who don't exhibit certainty traps. Try to find the people who are open to differing points of view and don't have an agenda of teaching. Here's what I think, and here's what you're going to think as a consequence. Well,
yeah, I mean, I think I think there's reasons. I think there are practical reasons why that's hard, why that applicant pool will be small. But I'll stop.
Let's turn to another member of our audience who asked, many campuses do not create an environment of openness, and certainty about certain social positions is expected. Any ideas how we can change that culture?
The way I think that, so I can change things. What I've experienced is I can change things sort of in my little corner of the world. What I've found is that, and this is that it really would take an institution throwing their weight behind it. And by it, I mean, say, like, let's say they want all incoming students to read The Certainty Trap, right? Obviously, this is fairly self-serving, but I write about it because I do believe that this is a way forward. And part of the reason that it can be a way forward is because it's politically neutral. Like, I'm not saying it's only left-wing views that should be questioned and challenged and clarified. I'm saying
Mhm.
all of it, right? I'm saying all of it. And so that in right, so that is that, so it is politically neutral in that respect. I mean, but I do think that a lot of campuses get sort of, I don't know if they've actually convinced themselves of anything, or if they believe their own what they're saying. But there's a lot of efforts now about, for instance, civil discourse and free speech, and I think that those are good. I think those are important, and I think those are steps in the right direction. But I also think that they are fairly superficial. Because, and here's what I mean by that. I mean that you could have a room or campus or whatever full of people following the norms, the protocols of civil discourse. You know, I'm listening respectfully and I'm repeating back what you say, and whatever, all of the whole down the list of the protocols, and entirely still stuck in the certainty trap.
Mhm.
So I think this is fundamentally about changing how we think. And I don't need everybody, you know, in a country of 340 million or whatever people we are, I don't need everyone to get on board. I need a critical mass, particularly in institutions.
One of the points in your book, you mentioned Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who draws the distinction between fast thinking and slow
Yeah.
thinking. How does that apply to the problem of certainty traps?
It's a great question. I mean, so I love Kahneman's work, obviously. And you know, Kahneman talks about, so the slow thinking is effortful and the fast thinking is easy and sort of snap judgments. I mean, avoiding the certainty trap is, I'm asking people to do something that they don't want to do. Certainty is, it feels great. Like, it feels righteous indignation, moral outrage, you know, it can serve all of these other social purposes in terms of, you know, making us feel morally superior, in terms of making us feel like we have a sense of belonging. Right, it can have creating a sense of community. So I'm asking people, I'm saying, actually, no, like, you have to care about something more than you care about that feeling of being right in order for this to matter. And so in the sense of how it maps to Kahneman's work, it's the slow, effortful, oh, I don't want to do that. But this other thing is so much easier, that I'm asking people to do. And what I'm trying to do is get them to understand why it matters, um, as best I can.
Well, let's turn to another audience question. This one has several parts. I'm a scientist who has studied critical thinking. Part
Yeah.
one. It seems to me there is a relationship with certainty thinking and the lack of the ability to do critical thinking. What do you say to that?
This is the first part.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's right. I think that's entirely right. The problem that I have with critical thinking, and I don't, it's not so much a problem with critical thinking as it is the name, is that it strikes me as, it's not clear what it means anymore. Like, so everybody has a different, and
Yeah.
I don't know what your audience members, what the participants' definition is, but people have such, like, if I say critical thinking, it's not clear that the other person sitting next to me would have the same definition. And what that
Mhm.
means is that nobody thinks they're not doing it. You will not find a teacher in K through 12 education or in higher education. I'd be shocked, you know, who, if you walk up to them and you say, do you think critical thinking is important? And they would say no. And right, so like, that would just, I mean, again, maybe there is somebody, but that would really surprise me. And it would certainly surprise me if they existed in any number. And so like, again, it's this, so the work, understanding the certainty trap and the problem of certainty, there is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of overlap between ideas around critical thinking, intellectual humility, curiosity. One of the things I sort of said, kind of said it in brief form in the talk, was that we are not, so take intellectual humility as an example. It's very easy to recognize in most cases when somebody else lacks intellectual humility. So for example, like, I'm having a conversation with somebody and I say, well, you seem really smug. Or, whether I say it or think it or whatever, it's one of those things. It's quite easy to see in other people. It's much easier. It's much more difficult to see when we lack it. And
Hmm.
so relying on our own sense, faculty, teachers, whatever, whoever, anyone, our own sense that, oh, we should be a little bit more curious, think critically, be willing to think critically, be intellectually humble here. It's not a good, it's not, you're gonna get a lot of, what would it be, false negatives. And so what I'm saying with the problem of certainty manifests in a particular way. And when it doesn't manifest in this way, it's not actually a problem. But what I'm saying is that the problematic manifestation is the sense that anybody who disagrees is a bigot, is hateful, is stupid, the answers are easy and obvious, and anybody who disagrees is an immoral moron. That is the manifestation. That is the response that is in fact the problem, and that should be the clue and the cue to question and clarify our thinking. And so that's so it does. So yes, to the first part of that question, it does have a lot of overlap with critical thinking. Um, with, I think, hopefully a useful distinction as well.
Hmm. Part two of the question:
Yeah.
Do you believe that critical thinking is teachable? And if you do, how and when should it be taught?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in sort of early childhood education, but I could imagine a world where critical thinking, as kind of, I assume the participant is defining it and sort of more consistent with how I would think about it, is taught starting at a really early age, although not, you're not introducing whatever gun control to first graders or something, right? But it's taught at an early age, or discussion about gun control to first graders, where it's taught at an early age. Part of what I think we need to do is we tend to get into, actually, I just put this this is something I just outlined in a paper that I submitted recently. We tend to ask the question, this comes up a lot of times with issues around gender. We tend to ask the question, at what age should students be taught about gender and sexuality, for example, right? This is the way, and there's arguments about like, oh, it should be at this age or whatever. I actually think there's a world where we're asking the wrong question, and that the question, particularly for contentious issues, so let's say for issues around gender identity or trans issue, whatever. And the question, rather than at what age, sorry, I know that light keeps going off, rather than asking at what age should students be learning about gender identity, we should be asking the question, at what age are students able to understand the controversial and contested nature of these claims? Right? And that it gets introduced as a function of when they're developmentally able to understand that it is actually contested, and not only contested, but contested along political lines, that becomes the sort of litmus test of when we should introduce these things. So I do think, so to the question, is critical thinking, is it teachable? I hope so. I mean, I think probably in some cases, yes, and maybe in some cases it's harder. Um, but I do think that part of the work that I do is just fundamentally getting people to understand that this is what's going on. That this relationship between certainty and judgment and contempt and social trust and democracy and all of this is what's going on. And then you can make an informed decision about how you want to proceed. It's very hard once this is clear. I mean, it's not that there aren't people who will do this, but it's very hard to then say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to do this. And, political polarization, viewpoint diversity, social trust be damned, full speed ahead. Let's just do it. Although at least if you did it knowing what the consequences were, at least that would be a little bit more honest in some ways, or more, not more honest, but more engaged with the reality of what's happening.
Mm-hmm. How is the certainty trap problem related to the rise of social media? If it is, how do you, if it is, how do you think it is?
Yeah,
Are
I
they
mean,
connected?
I think social media, I think so. Social media creates incentives for certainty. In the sense that, so if I'm saying certainty drives moral outrage and righteous indignation and snark and all that stuff,
Mhm.
certainty, social media rewards all of those things. Right. So social media is the or it creates an ecosystem where those behaviors that are bad for democracy, political conversations, et cetera, are rewarded. So one of the comments that I'm making a particular set of assumptions in this work, in assuming that people will care about the certainty trap and avoiding it. I'm assuming, and this was in one of the slides, I'm assuming that people either care about sort of having a robust, politically pluralistic society, or that they care about understanding what's true about the world, and that these are the things that they are trying to optimize for. That assumption doesn't always work. And as I'm coming back to your social media point, there are a couple of situations where that breaks down. One of them is if I'm trying to build, let's say my goal is to build a giant social media following, then I have a different set of incentives, right? So my incentives are to be outraged, to be sort of pissed off, and like, because that's what's going, thoughtful, measured posts, and is not what's going to get. It's not what's going to get a lot of engagement. It's not what's going to get a lot of
Yeah.
visibility. So it's just another example of where my assumption breaks down, I think, is oftentimes when people are running for political office, right? You have a very clear incentive to say, um, vote for me, I'm the good guy, don't vote for that person, he's the bad guy, right? So this sort of binary thinking for all kinds of reasons, but that's a different set of incentives. Um, I think that my assumption about caring about a robust democracy, et cetera, and understanding what's true about the world, I think holds for most people most of the time. It does not hold for everybody all of the time.
Right. Well, here's another question from the audience. Um, and yet, decide we must. Do you have any guidance for leaders who acknowledge uncertainty and yet are in a position where a decision must be made?
So ask the question one more time. I just want to make sure I'm getting it right.
Decide we must. Do you have
Yes.
guidance for leaders who acknowledge uncertainty and yet are in a position where they have to make a decision?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So it doesn't mean, so first of all, like we should have more leaders who acknowledge uncertainty. Like, if only that were the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and by uncertainty, I mean uncertainty, again, particularly this uncertainty on the contentious topics. Um, and about with respect to making decisions, it's interesting. Avoiding the certainty trap doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't make decisions and I'll even take out the necessarily. It doesn't mean that we can't make decisions, that policies can't be put into place, that, you know, that action can't and shouldn't be taken at various points. What it has implications for is how we view people who disagree, right? So and it also has implications, frankly, for
Mm-hmm.
how the extent to which we're willing to kind of revisit um, our decisions once they're made, to say, oh, that didn't actually play out the way I thought it played out, right? So it has that implication as well. But again, the sort of the other one is just about um, how do we view decisions have to get made. We have to, right? So decide we must. How do we view people who aren't on board with that decision? And do we view them as just like, a hateful troglodyte who won't get on board? Or do we view them as like, yeah, you know what, I get it. I get what the concerns are. We're going forward with this anyway. And right, but like, and I see where the concerns are. Or some, right. Like I do think it has, and I do think it has implications in terms of how those decisions and and people who are in disagreement with them are viewed, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's another question from a listener.
Yeah.
Do you consider that absolute truth exists independent of the ability of humans to perceive it?
Oh, see, now this is speaks to my heart. Of the philosophical, like I love the philosophical question. And I have a chance to go into this more in the book. I have a whole section where I talk about sort of questions, the difference between questions that have answers, but that we can't know the answers, and questions that don't have answers, right? Where the latter being, what happens after you die, and then a question that has an answer, but that doesn't, questions that have an answer, but that we wouldn't, like the example I use in the book is, I think I use this example of, let's say that the thing that we wanted to know was how many lizards there are in the world. And right, so it's a question that seems like it should have an answer. It does have an answer, but we can't, because of the limits of human knowledge. It's sort of all other kinds of other practical limitations. So here's how I would answer the question of an absolute truth. I do think that, so a couple of answers. Personally, I think that truth probably does exist. I'm not sure, avoiding the certainty trap. What it means is it actually applies whether you think there's an absolute objective truth, et cetera, or not. All it requires is the belief that truth is worth looking for. And kind of like if you go back to the graph that I had up, that there's always some chance that we're wrong. And that truth, it's sort of something that we move towards asymptotically, and that we're never quite there. But the fact that we're never quite there doesn't have to mean that it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Next question. How do students at University of Austin compare with students at U of I?
So I'm sorry, I'm actually not at the University of Austin anymore. When I was affiliated with the Mill Institute, I was sort of linked to the University of Austin for 2 years. I know they took their first cohort of students, of full-time students this year, of incoming students. I can say that when I was at the University of Austin and I did some programming with students when they were just running kind of non-degree enrollment programming, they were very intellectually curious. They were very, they were, they sort of drawn to the ideas of viewpoint diversity and free speech. I would say that I don't know. My experience again with the University of Illinois is that I have found students to be quite open. It is probably the case that again, the most extreme, the sort of most certainty trap stuck students are not probably going to find their way to my class.
Yeah.
But in general, my experience has been one where they're quite open.
Well, next question comes from someone who has been one of your former Institute fellows. Patrick,
cool.
he says, "Hi, Ilana. This is one of your former Mill Institute fellows, Patrick. I found your certainty confidence paradigm very helpful, personally and in my classroom. We know there's no shortage of students who need to learn to be less certain, but I'm curious how frequently you encounter students with the opposite problem, underconfidence, excessive skepticism, disengagement, perhaps because they're so turned off by constant political controversies. How do you approach those students?"
Who are disengaged.
Yeah, too skeptical, disengaged.
Yeah, I guess I would put disengaged and skeptical in different buckets. So there's a problem of disengagement in higher education, which doesn't necessarily can have something to do with certainty, which doesn't, like I have, the students who sit in the back and who have their headphones on and their hoods pulled up.
Uh-huh.
Right, like that's a disengagement that may have no philosophical connection. There's also, in terms of the too skeptical, I guess I'm not, yeah, there is a version of being too skeptical. So that first of all, the whole language of too skeptical implies that there's like a right amount of skepticism, and this person has crossed over that line. But I think I sort of know. I think I get what the question is getting at. Whenever we encounter people who like, sometimes what people will ask is, well, what do you do with people who just have weird beliefs or they refuse to believe the truth or whatever? When you bump up against those kinds of issues, those kinds of questions, topics, a lot of times what it comes down to is trust in, let me give you, is trust in institutions. Sorry. And I'll give you an example. When I was talking to a friend of mine, this was like a year and a half ago, and she is someone who is more, I don't love the term conspiracy theories because it feels very dismissive to me, but I mean, it's a useful shorthand. And so she is someone who is more inclined to be open to that sort of kind of thinking. And so I was talking to her, and she was talking in particular on this conversation. She was talking about sex trafficking, and I don't know if it was, I can't remember if it was about minors or in general. I don't remember the details, but she was talking about sex trafficking, and she was talking about how she had read or she believed or something that, basically like it was this political sort of plot conspiracy that there were people benefiting from it at the top levels. I know you get into some QAnon stuff here. I don't know if that's where she was going with it, but she was saying, she was talking specifically about this issue that there were people benefiting from it, and this was why they hadn't cracked down on it, et cetera. And was again because like there are people who are actually sort of actively participating in elected officials who are actively participating in it and benefiting from it. And I said to her, I said, I get that. I said, I get it. I said, I totally get, I get how you would get there. I see how you could get there from here. I said, I said, sorry, I'm losing my voice. Here's another possible explanation. This is what I said to her. I said, here's another possible explanation that there's no one actually benefiting from it. I said, obviously I don't have any secret information here, but let's just say, here's another explanation. No one's actually benefiting from this thing personally, individually. There's no elected official plot. I said, and for reasons that I don't totally understand, some social problems and social issues rise to the top of the pile and others don't. And that probably has something to do with lobbying and advocacy and money and numbers of people affected, but it doesn't have to do with people benefiting and some sort of sinister plot going on. I said, I see how you got to your conclusion. I said, help me understand why that explanation is the one that I should believe rather than this explanation over here. And where you end up when you ask those questions is you end up with trust in institutions. And the one thing that erodes trust in institutions, perhaps as much as corruption, is certainty, is the certainty trap. And so those, I guess I see those as kind of intricately tied together, if that makes sense.
I think that makes sense, and we're just about at 3:30.
Yeah.
So I think perhaps we've used up our time, and I'll say thanks for joining us. And I hope that you mentioned your next book. Well, let me know when that comes out.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I'm still writing it, so it'll be a little while.
Well, thank you very much, Ilana Redstone. And for all of our participants today, I hope you got a good deal out of this wonderful discussion about the problem of the certainty trap. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.